Does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? That's the question we're discussing tonight. Approximately 2 billion people in the world identify themselves as Christians. For Christians, Jesus is thought of as being the very Son of God. For Muslims, Jesus, or Isa, is revered as a great prophet. Many Jews see a loyal example in Jesus, or Yeshua, as a model Israelite who made a positive impact on this world by his life and teachings. However, what can we know about Jesus of Nazareth historically? Is the New Testament a reliable source for discovering historical material about him? Or should we be more cautious about what we can know about Jesus? Tonight, this question will be answered by two of the leading lights in historical Jesus research. I will introduce each presenter before they come to the stage to give their answer to the evening's question. I'll begin with Dr. Evans. Craig Evans is the Payzant Distinguished Professor of New Testament at Acadia Divinity College, right here at Acadia University in Wolfville. He is a graduate of Claremont McKenna College. He received his Master of Divinity from Western Baptist Seminary in Portland, Oregon. He also received his Ph.D. in Biblical Studies from Claremont Graduate University in Southern California. He has also been awarded the Doctor of Habilitation by the Karoli Gaspard Reformed University in Budapest. A well-known evangelical scholar throughout the world, he is an elected member of the prestigious SNTS, which is a society dedicated to New Testament studies. After teaching 1 year at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Professor Evans taught at Trinity Western University in British Columbia for 21 years, where he directed the graduate program in biblical studies and founded the Dead Sea Scrolls Institute. He was also a visiting fellow at Princeton Theological Seminary in Princeton, New Jersey. He's the author and editor of more than 60 books and hundreds of articles and reviews, including the highly acclaimed Fabricating Jesus, How Modern Scholars Distort the Gospels, as well as Jesus, the Final Days, co-authored with N.T. Wright, and the upcoming book, Jesus and His World, The Archaeological Evidence. Professor Evans has given lectures at Cambridge, Oxford, Durham, Yale, and other universities, colleges, seminaries, and museums such as the Field Museum in Chicago, the Canadian Museum of Civilization in Ottawa, and the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto. He also regularly lectures and gives talks at popular conferences and retreats on the historical Jesus, archaeology, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Bible. Along with countless interviews on radio networks across Canada and the U.S., Dr. Evans has been seen on Dateline NBC, CBC, CTV, Day of Discovery, and many documentaries aired on BBC, the Discovery Channel, History Television, and others. He also has served as a consultant for the National Geographic Society. Dr. Evans is married to his wife Ginny, is the father of 2 grown children, Carrie and Jill, and has a grandson, Merrick, who brings him joy. We are very fortunate to have a scholar with the pedigree of Professor Evans teaching right here at Acadia. So, Dr. Evans, does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? Would you welcome Dr. Evans to the stage?
Thank you very much, Greg, and allow me to extend my welcome and appreciation to Professor Bart Ehrman for coming up to Nova Scotia in the middle of January and participating in this lively discussion and on this very important topic. I really appreciate that, Bart. Does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? Yes, it does. But a number of qualifications are called for. First, only a portion of the New Testament is concerned with history. The principal source for material from which we may derive a portrait of the historical Jesus are the 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They are called synoptic because they overlap a lot and we can see them together, which is what the Greek word means. See them together in parallel columns. John's gospel is another matter. What genre is it? It's not another synoptic gospel, as some would like to think. All agree that there is some history in John, but is it primarily history, or is it something else? I leave discussion of that question to scholars who specialize in the study of the Gospel of John. In a few of his letters, Paul, the apostle, alludes to some of Jesus' teaching. He retells the story of Jesus' words spoken at the Last Supper, and he recites the early Christian creed about the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, and then his appearances to various people, including himself. There are passing references to Jesus' teaching, to events in his life, here and there in the other writings of the New Testament. But that's about it. I should remind you, of course, that Paul was personally acquainted, as he tells us in one of his letters, with James, the brother of Jesus, and with Peter, Jesus' principal disciple, and with at least one other of the original disciples, and that person would be John. Secondly, even our primary sources of information about the historical Jesus, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, is part history and part interpretation. Not only that, the part that is historical is not always historical in the way we moderns typically imagine how history ought to be written. I'll explain what I mean in a moment. In talking about the New Testament Gospels and the historical Jesus, we need to avoid two extremes. One extreme, and tonight let's call it the extreme on the left, the extreme on the right, tends to think that every verse and every word in the Gospels are historical, that the words of Jesus have been recorded word for word. The events described are described exactly and in precise chronological sequence. Folk who see the Gospels this way often place a priority on the historical, or at least on what is perceived to be historical. If it is historical, then we know it is true. So goes the reasoning. I have encountered many students over the years who think this way. Perhaps they've been taught this way in formal settings. Perhaps they've simply assumed it. When they come under my teaching and begin to learn that there is a literary relationship between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that two of them, Matthew and Luke, directly drew upon the third, Mark, some of these students are uncomfortable, at least initially. The students had assumed that the three Gospels were written independently of one another. When they hear that Matthew and Luke edited the material that they had inherited from Mark and then edited and placed in different locations, the material that they inherited from a collection of Jesus' teaching, a collection mostly of sayings, usually called Q, they usually become more uncomfortable. But when they learn more about this important topic, the discomfort usually dissipates. They come to understand that through this comparative study and noticing the changes, the differences, indeed the discrepancies, they are able more clearly to see the theological message of each of the respective evangelists. And they come to understand that indeed each gospel presents history and interpretation. The other extreme, let's call it the extreme on the left, tends to think that differences and discrepancies observed when we compare Matthew, Mark, and Luke are sure signs that these Gospels are unhistorical, that deriving a coherent picture of the historical Jesus from them is impossible. There is an even more extreme version of these skeptics who, like Canada's Tom Harper suggests that there really is no historical evidence for Jesus and that therefore he probably did not exist. The Gospels are not historical in any sense, according to Harper. They are no more than a myth that conveys truth about a religious idea that originated in Egypt. This extreme view is rightly recognized as absurd by virtually all scholars and historians. Accordingly, I will tonight not reference it, but limit my remarks to the less extreme view on the left. Members of the extreme right and extreme left sometimes play a game. The game is to identify discrepancies and apparent contradictions. The left claims these discrepancies are fatal. The right says they all can be explained away. The left, in reference to the Bible as a whole, and not simply to the Gospels, a fellow named Christian Smith, who is on the faculty of Notre Dame and is acquainted with Bart Ehrman, describes this game as, and now I'm quoting him, as the exercise of finding long lists of scripture texts that appear to contradict each other, to which some sophomoric skeptics devote themselves in order to try to undermine the Bible's coherence and authority. That merely mirrors the worst kind of fundamentalist literalism to which few thoughtful evangelicals subscribe, and betrays pitiable misunderstandings of how human language works, end of quote. I agree. I would add that this game betrays a very inadequate understanding of ancient education and the writing of history in the light of which the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke must be studied. So how should we understand these Gospels? Any careful, fair reading of the Gospels side by side will reveal a number of differences and discrepancies. Some of these discrepancies are more apparent than real, but many of them are indeed real. We observe differences in the wording of Jesus' teaching. Sayings clustered together in one gospel, say in a Matthean discourse, for example, are scattered over several chapters in another gospel, as, for example, we see in Luke's central section. The order and sequence of a number of episodes sometimes vary from one gospel to another. Details and parallel stories sometimes vary, and on it goes. Do these discrepancies mean that we cannot find substantial historical material in the Gospels? Not at all. Allow me to reference the work of someone who is widely recognized as a great New Testament scholar. The very man who hired me at McMaster University in 1980. I refer to E.P. Sanders, Ed to all his friends. Sanders taught at McMaster from 1966 to 1984. From 1984 to 1990, he was Dean Ireland's Professor of Holy Scripture at Oxford University. Sanders moved to Duke University in 1990, where he retired in 2005. In his introduction to his critically acclaimed Jesus and Judaism, which was published in 1985, Sanders remarks, "The dominant view today seems to be that we can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish, that we can know a lot about what he said, and that those two things make sense within the world of first century Judaism." End of quote. Note what Sanders said. The dominant view today. He didn't say the view of some, or the view of a very few naive fundamentalists, but the dominant view of a majority or of major scholars. Sanders began his work by identifying what he called the almost indisputable facts, and those are his words, concerning Jesus. Here are 7 of them. Number 1, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Number 2, Jesus was a Galilean who preached and healed. Number 3, Jesus called disciples and spoke of there being 12. Number 4, Jesus confined his activity to Israel. Number 5, Jesus engaged in a controversy about the temple. And number 6, Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem by the Roman authorities. And number 7, After his death, Jesus' followers continued as an identifiable movement. To these facts, one can add a few more complementary details. I think that it is highly probable that Jesus was viewed by the public as a prophet, that he spoke often of the kingdom of God. In other words, that was the basic part of his message. And that in his temple controversy in Jerusalem, he was involved with quarreling with the aristocratic ruling priesthood. And moreover, that when he was crucified under the title of King of the Jews. These additional details are not particularly controversial, and most Jesus scholars are ready to accept them. Sanders went on to find a substantial body of sayings of Jesus that cohere with these historical facts, these almost indisputable facts, oftentimes either explaining them or being explained by them. The coherence between sayings and these various facts that frame Jesus' ministry cohere with one another. I mention Sanders on this occasion because he's not especially conservative in his views, and he is certainly no fundamentalist. The discrepancies of the Gospels did not prevent Ed Sanders from finding in these same Gospels a coherent, plausible portrait of the historical Jesus. That's why I believe we can answer the question put forward to us this evening: does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? I think we can answer that question in the affirmative. Most scholars are not troubled by such discrepancies, recognizing a number of factors at work, such as the diversity of the material and the selecting and editing work of the respective evangelists. What many readers of the Gospels may not know is that the discrepancies in the Gospels began with Jesus himself. Jesus' teaching was not static and unchanging. It was adaptable. It was situational. It was applied to a variety of settings, and it was altered as the occasion required. And remember, these themes were repeated over and over again and in various locations. His disciples taught accordingly. Yes, they were to learn his teaching, to memorize his words, but they were expected to apply them to the needs of evangelism and teaching. These disciples, or learners, and the Greek word in the plural would be mathetai, from the Greek verb that means to learn. These learners, these disciples, could hardly claim to be genuine disciples if their learning never progressed beyond rote memory and mere repetition. How do we know this? We know it because this was the understanding of education and pedagogy in late antiquity, in both Jewish and Greco-Roman society. Jewish and Greco-Roman pedagogies, that is how you teach, were not separate and isolated from one another. Most of the rabbinic rules of exegesis, that is how the rabbis in Jesus' time and later, how they taught and how they thought Scripture should be exegeted and so on, were learned from the Greeks, from the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Greek and Jewish memory techniques and practice overlapped. Indeed, the Greek gymnasium was present on Jewish soil, even in the vicinity of Jerusalem itself, as early as the 2nd century BC. Young Greeks began their education by memorizing krei, brief anecdotes, in which a well-known figure says or does something significant and of value. Hence, kreia, which means in Greek literally useful. As the student progresses, he learns to insert a kreia into his argument or to string together several kreia in plural, and in doing so he is free to edit the beginnings and the endings of these kreia. The student is not only permitted to edit these pithy anecdotes, he is required to do so for the sake of clarity. This point needs to be underscored. Recitation of these anecdotes presupposed memorization, but memorization did not prohibit a change of wording, nor did it prohibit expansion or contraction. and clustering in various ways, so long as the change remained true to the original meaning and intent. The overarching concern always was clarity. New Testament scholars have discovered the Crea form in the Gospels, particularly Matthew, Mark, and Luke. This has been much discussed in the literature of the last 25 years or so. Indeed, the church father Papias, who writing in the early 2nd century A.D., wrote a large work on the teaching of Jesus. Most of this work is lost. We have several quotations. In one of the surviving fragments, usually numbered number 3, he mentions the evangelist Mark, saying that Mark, quote, wrote down accurately everything he remembered from Peter, though not in order, and that also he followed Peter and adapted his teaching as Creae, literally, or as useful anecdotes. As in the case of Crea, so in the Gospels we observe relatively stabilized units of tradition introduced and contextualized in various ways. This editing, adapting, clustering, and contextualizing quite naturally created and creates still to this day differences and discrepancies. This always happens when we have overlapping parallel accounts whose purposes and styles vary. The ancients knew this, so did the early Christians who gathered the parallel yet discrepant Gospels side by side in 2nd and 3rd century books or codices. The stories and teachings of Jesus have been edited and contextualized in ways that lead to clarity. The teaching of Jesus has been applied in new ways, and new insights have been discovered as his followers encounter fresh challenges. All of this reflects the way Jesus taught his disciples. It reflects the pedagogy, that is the instruction, the way people taught and learned of the time. The disciples were not tape recorders, mere reciters of the Jesus tradition. They were disciples, learners, trained to understand the teaching of Jesus, not simply to repeat it word for word. They were trained to apply it as they gave leadership to the followers of Jesus, a following that in time would become known as the church. It is to this training, this ability to apply Jesus' teaching in new and creative ways, that the saying of Jesus in Matthew 13 alludes, where Jesus says, quote, therefore, every scribe who has been discipled, has been trained, mathituthes, for the kingdom of heaven is like a householder who brings out of his treasure what is new and what is old. Matthew 13:52. Jesus did not say, every scribe who has been discipled for the kingdom of heaven must repeat my words verbatim. In reference to this verse, 2 major New Testament scholars in their commentary on Matthew comment, rightly in my view, quote, the ability to teach things new and old rests upon the ability to understand Jesus' teaching. Precisely. I believe that most Christians do not understand the genre and nature of biblical literature when it comes to writings that are ostensibly historical. Broadly speaking, there is a tendency to impose upon them a modern understanding of what constitutes proper history. When someone is quoted, we expect the quotation to be verbatim and to be set off with quotation marks. We expect strict chronology and sequence. If sources are cited, we expect footnotes. If the Gospels or other writings from late antiquity appear to violate these modern canons, we speak of contradictions, mistakes, errors, factual errors, and so on. The Gospels reflect a world quite different from our own. Proper historiography, the writing of history in late antiquity, allowed for and sometimes required editing and paraphrasing, always for the sake of clarification. This is what we see in the Gospels. We find in the New Testament Gospels a plausible portrait of the historical Jesus, a portrait that is true to what we know of the time in which Jesus and his disciples lived. This is why so many well-educated, capable scholars make use of the New Testament Gospels as their primary source for studying the life and teaching of Jesus of Nazareth. People who take the Gospels seriously and desire to understand better the Jesus of history have nothing to fear from rigorous critical scholarship. The problem, as I see it, is that far too many do not know what the Gospels are and do not know how to interpret them. Many moderns, whether naive Christians or naive non-Christians, read the Gospels with a modern understanding of what historical writings are supposed to be. This problem is compounded by fundamentalism and what is also called biblicism, in which the New Testament Gospels, and indeed all writings that are found in the Bible, are interpreted in rigid and uncritical ways. The type of history conveyed by the Gospel is simply not understood. The discrepancies are forcibly harmonized or ignored, and textual variants are seen as embarrassments. It is believed that all of these things must be done away with. I conclude by calling attention to the recently published book entitled The Bible Made Impossible: Why Biblicism is Not a Truly Evangelical Reading of Scripture. The book is by Christian Smith, which I quoted a few minutes ago. Smith rightly warns of the danger of defining the Gospels and the Bible as a whole in a way that is out of touch with the data and therefore is completely indefensible. A naive biblicist understanding of the Gospels will, Smith tells us, quote, sometimes collapse when antagonistic non-biblicists point and press home real problems with biblicist theory. Smith quotes Fuller Seminary's professor of Old Testament John Goldingay, who makes the same point, stating that an unrealistic understanding of narratives in the Bible, quote, sets up misleading expectations regarding the precision of narratives and then requires such far-fetched defenses that it presses people toward rejecting it. To this, Smith adds, biblicism often paints smart, committed youth into a corner that is for real reasons impossible to occupy for many of those who actually confront its problems. I conclude by saying believing Christians and those who inquire into the meaning of Christian belief have nothing to fear with regard to the evidence. But will they make the intellectual commitment to become acquainted with this evidence and put it to good use? I hope they do. If they do not, they will continue to be easy prey for the skeptics who often hold to very dubious theories themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Evans. Before I give a proper introduction for Dr. Ehrman, let me mention that the phone number in your program is actually not the correct one to text in questions for Dr. Ehrman. The phone number to text questions to Dr. Ehrman is the one located on the screen, 902-497-1697. Bart Ehrman is the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He came to UNC in 1988 after 4 years of teaching at Rutgers University. At UNC, he has served as both the Director of Graduate Studies and the Chair of the Department of Religious Studies. A graduate of Wheaton College in Illinois, Professor Ehrman received both his Master's of Divinity and Ph.D. from Princeton Theological Seminary, where his 1985 doctoral dissertation was awarded magna cum laude. Since then, he has published extensively in the fields of New Testament and early Christianity, having written or edited more than 25 books, numerous scholarly articles, and dozens of book reviews. Among his most recent books are a Greek-English edition of the Apostolic Fathers for the Loeb Classical Library, an assessment of the newly discovered Gospel of Judas, and 4 New York Times bestsellers. Folks, biblical studies, New York Times bestsellers, that doesn't go hand in hand too often. That's pretty impressive. These 4 books are Jesus Interrupted, an account of scholarly views of the New Testament; God's Problem, an assessment of the biblical views of suffering; Misquoting Jesus, an overview of the changes found in the surviving copies of the New Testament and of the scribes who produced them. And Forged, which discusses why some books in the New Testament are deliberate forgeries. His books have been translated into 27 languages. Among his fields of scholarly expertise are the historical Jesus, the early Christian Apocrypha, the Apostolic Fathers, and the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. Professor Ehrman has served as president of the Southeast region of the Society of Biblical Literature, chair of the New Testament Textual Criticism section of the Society, book review editor of the Journal of Biblical Literature, and editor of the monograph series, The New Testament in the Greek Fathers. He currently serves as co-editor of the series New Testament Tools, Studies, and Documents, co-editor-in-chief for the journal Vigile Christiane, and on several other editorial boards for journals and monographs in the field. Professor Ehrman has appeared on CNN, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and the Colbert Report. Professor Ehrman has 2 children, a daughter Kelly and a son Derek. He is also a grandfather of 2. He is married to Sarah Beckwith. She holds her Ph.D. from King's College London and is the Marcello Lotti Professor of English at Duke University. Note that he teaches at University of North Carolina. She teaches at Duke. How do they deal with the sports competitions? That must be fun table talk. We are very fortunate to have Professor Ehrman join us in Nova Scotia, all the way from North Carolina. We are very glad that you are here with us today. Dr. Ehrman, let me ask you, does the New Testament present a reliable portrait of the historical Jesus? Let's give Dr. Ehrman a warm Nova Scotian welcome as he comes to the podium.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure being here with you all, as we say in the South, y'all. Yeah, so the deal with my wife and I, we got married 10 years ago, and we have a problem because Duke and UNC, especially this time of year during basketball, they're in fierce competition. And we worked out a compromise. I told Sarah we would live near the Duke campus if she would root for the Tar Heels. And that's what happens. So, well, it's a pleasure being with you. I'm glad we made it through the snows of Nova Scotia. And it's always a pleasure to debate with Craig. Our debates are, as a rule, rather lively, and I hope that will be the case tonight. I'm not going to be responding directly to Craig's talk at this stage, since I didn't know what he was going to say, I'm going to save that for my rebuttal. I have my own presentation that I want to make, and then we will have some back and forth. Let me say something about the topic that we're talking about. The topic tonight has to do with the historical Jesus. The historical Jesus. We're not debating whether the Bible tells great stories about Jesus, or about whether the Bible provides the basis for an adequate theology of Jesus. We're not debating the literary merits or the theological adequacy of the Bible. We're debating its historical reliability. Its historical reliability. And we're not asking whether the Bible writers did a good job by the standards of their day. We're talking about our day. Can we, today, trust that the Bible is historically reliable in what it has to say about Jesus? I once had Craig's view of this matter. But the more research I did, the more I realized it would not hold up to critical scrutiny. What Craig says is absolutely right when he quotes Ed Sanders as indicating that the dominant view among scholars is that we can know a good deal about what Jesus said and did. That's absolutely right. That is the dominant view among scholars. Scholars know that we can figure out what Jesus said and did. But it is not because the Gospels, as they have come to us, give us reliable portraits of the historical Jesus. If the Gospels gave us historical, reliable information about Jesus, if their portraits of Jesus were historically reliable, we would not need scholarship. All we would need to do would be to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and what they said about Jesus would be historically accurate. And so there'd be no need for scholarship at all. But neither Ed Sanders, nor Craig, nor I thinks that, in fact, you can read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and take them at face value as giving you a historically reliable portrait of Jesus. No scholar of the historical Jesus, except for fundamentalists whom Craig was attacking, and very conservative evangelicals, thinks this. Every scholar realizes that the reason there has to be scholarship on the historical Jesus is precisely because the Gospels do not give us historically reliable portraits of Jesus. The way you can realize this for yourself is by learning how scholars read the New Testament accounts of Jesus. There are, of course, a number of ways that you can read the Bible on your own. A number of ways you can read the Gospels. You can read the Gospels the way you read any other book, which would be what I call a vertical reading. A vertical reading is when you start at the top of the page and you read to the bottom of the page, which of course is a sensible way to read a page. Go from the top, go to the bottom. And then when you want to read a gospel, you start at the beginning and you go to the end. Again, a sensible way to read a book. A vertical reading is you start at the beginning and you go from top to bottom, top to bottom, top to bottom until you get to the end. That's a perfectly legitimate way of reading the Bible. You should certainly read the Bible that way. The gospel should be read that way. Scholars have another way of reading the Gospels, however, which I call a horizontal reading. In a horizontal reading, what one does is one reads an account of Jesus in one of the Gospels and then reads the same account in a different Gospel and compares the two. You read across the Gospels. You put them in parallel columns and you read across them. When you do that, you find the bogeyman that Craig has pointed out, discrepancies. There are numerous discrepancies in the New Testament Gospels that make it impossible for scholars to say that the Gospels give us reliable portraits of the historical Jesus. And my intention is to show you why. Let me first give you just a few examples of the kind of discrepancies you can find if you do a horizontal reading. The benefit of this kind of argument is that you don't have to take my word for it. You can go home and do it yourself, and I can assure you you're going to find what I'm telling you. Let's take a rather important matter, the death of Jesus. But within that important matter, let's take a rather minor question. When did Jesus die? Well, you think, well, you know, that's a historical question and should have a historical answer for that. And if the Gospels are historically reliable portraits of Jesus, they'll give us a historically reliable answer. When did Jesus die? It's interesting that two of our Gospels tell us explicitly when Jesus died, and what is striking is they disagree. The first account is the Gospel of Mark, our earliest Gospel. Mark maintains that Jesus died sometime during the Passover feast in Jerusalem. Now, the Passover feast was an annual festival that was celebrated, still celebrated by Jews today. And the way it was celebrated in Jerusalem in the days of Jesus is that Jews would come into town and they would prepare for the Passover. The only tricky thing about everything I'm going to say in this illustration is that you have to remember how Jews traditionally tell time. In Jewish reckoning, the new day begins when it gets dark. When it gets dark. So for most of us, the new day begins at midnight, not for Jews. Jews, when it gets dark, that's the next day. That's why today when somebody celebrates Sabbath, that's on Saturday, but they have the Sabbath meal on Friday night. Well, why would they do it on Friday night? Because the Sabbath begins when it gets dark on Friday night, and it lasts that night until the next day when it turns Saturday night, when it becomes night, then it's the day after Sabbath. And the same thing with Passover. The Passover meal was eaten the day after it was prepared, but it was prepared that afternoon. In other words, the day of preparation for the Passover, Jews would sacrifice a lamb in the temple, and they would gather the foods together, and they'd get ready for the meal. The meal would be that night after the day of preparation. When it turns night, it's the next day, and it's the Passover day. Then you eat your meal, you go to bed, you get up, it's still the Passover until it gets dark, and then it's the day after Passover. All right. In the Gospel of Mark, the disciples come up to Jesus, and they ask him, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover?" Mark 14:12. Jesus tells them, they prepare the Passover. And that night, they eat the Passover. And Jesus takes the symbolic foods of the Passover and he instills even greater significance into them. This bread, this unleavened bread, is my body that's broken for you. This wine, one of the 4 cups of wine drunk at the meal, this wine is the blood of the new covenant poured out for you. And so Jesus instills new significance in these Passover foods. After the meal, he goes out to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he's arrested after being betrayed by Judas Iscariot. He spends the night in jail. The next morning, this is Passover day, the next morning, Jesus goes on trial before Pontius Pilate, who finds him guilty and sends him off to be crucified. And he's put on the cross at 9 o'clock in the morning on the day of Passover. Perfectly clear and unambiguous. Mark 14:12, Mark 15:25, they tell us when it was. Turn to a second account, the Gospel of John, written maybe 20, 30 years after the Gospel of Mark. The Gospel of John also explicitly dates when Jesus died. Explicitly dates when Jesus died. Once again, it's in connection with the Passover feast. But in this case, the disciples don't ask Jesus, where do you want us to prepare the Passover? And there's no reference to the symbolic foods of the Passover at their last meal. It's not called a Passover meal. After this last meal, whatever it is, Jesus is arrested, spends the night in jail, goes on trial before Pontius Pilate, and we're told when it was. Now, this was on the day of preparation for the Passover. Wait a second. The day of preparation for the Passover, that's, according to Mark, Jesus lived through that day, and he had Passover that night, and it was the next day that he died. In Mark's gospel, he dies after eating the Passover meal, but in John's gospel, he dies the afternoon before eating the Passover meal. How can they both be right? Well, they can't both be right. Jesus died only once. Well, which day was it? It is interesting that in John's gospel, we have the only gospel in which Jesus is identified as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. John chapter 1, verse 29, and John chapter 1, verse 35. John thinks Jesus is the Lamb. And it's no accident that John has Jesus killed precisely on the same day and at the same hour that the Passover lamb was being killed in the temple. Why? Because for John, Jesus is the Passover lamb. John is willing to change a historical datum in order to make his theological point, to show that Jesus really is the Lamb. You don't get that unless you admit that there's a discrepancy here. That is perfectly fine for theology. It makes for a great literary story, and it makes for compelling theology. But to get to the theology, John has had to change a historical datum. This happens time after time after time in the Gospels. Go from the death of Jesus to the birth of Jesus. The birth of Jesus is recounted in Matthew and Luke. Those two Gospels are our only two Gospels. There are a number of problems historically with these accounts. I'm not saying they're problematic as stories. They're fantastic stories. And I'm not saying they're problematic theologically. Christians have long built many theological beliefs on these two stories. I'm not discounting their literary or their theological quality. I'm talking about their historical value. For one thing, they are filled with implausibilities. Give you one. According to Luke's gospel, the reason Jesus got born in Bethlehem was just kind of an accident of timing. His parents actually came from Nazareth, way up north. Well, if they're from Nazareth, why wasn't he born in Nazareth? Well, according to Luke, there was a tax where the entire world had to be taxed when Caesar Augustus was the ruler of Rome. And everybody had to return to their ancestral home to register for the tax. So there's this census, and Joseph has to register from the census, and he comes from the family of David. Well, David was born in Bethlehem, so Joseph has to register in Bethlehem. So he has to go to Bethlehem to register. He takes his fiancée with him, his betrothed with him. They register there. While they're there, she happens to give birth. After she gives birth, they perform the rite of purification in the temple 32 days later, and they go back to Nazareth. So that Jesus is born in Bethlehem, but he's raised in Nazareth, according to Luke. But there is no way that this census ever happened. There was never a worldwide tax under Caesar Augustus. We know this from Roman history. Moreover, Luke says this happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, but we know that Quirinius was not the governor of Syria when King Herod was the king of the Jews. And think about the plausibilities of the case. This is a tax where everybody in the Roman Empire is returning to their ancestral home. Joseph goes to Bethlehem because David from 1,000 years earlier came from Bethlehem. So everybody in the empire is returning to his ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier to register for a census? So suppose the Canadian government decides that you all need to be taxed more, and the way they're going to do this tax is you all have to register for it. And that means you have to go to your ancestral home from where your ancestor came from 1,000 years ago. Where are you going to go exactly? And everybody in the Roman Empire is doing this, and it doesn't even make it into the newspaper. It's not mentioned anywhere else. It's completely implausible, so much so that biblical scholars are unified in saying, except for fundamentalists and very conservative evangelicals, are unified in saying it really didn't happen. There are other problems with these accounts. There are contradictions between what Matthew has to say and what Luke has to say. If you remember in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and then King Herod decides he's going to try and kill the child as he learns from the wise men that he's been born. And so he sends the troops, but Joseph escapes with his family by going to Egypt. So they escape the wrath of Herod. But according to Luke, after 32 days after the rite of purification, they went to Nazareth. Well, if they escaped to Egypt, how could they go 32 days later to Nazareth? It doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? They've got two different traditions, and they've given two different traditions, which might be fantastic stories and might be good theology, but they don't work historically. The genealogies of Jesus in these accounts of Matthew and Luke don't work historically. Both Matthew and Luke trace Jesus' genealogical line through Joseph. Now, you might wonder why they would do that, since Joseph wasn't really related by blood to Jesus, but they do it. They both trace the line through Joseph. Read both genealogies, Luke chapter 3 and Matthew chapter 1, and ask yourself, who is Joseph's father? They're different. Grandfather, different. Great-grandfather, different. The genealogies are different all the way back to King David. Why? They've got different sources and they're relating what they've heard, but they both can't be right. These differences between the Gospels relate not only to discrepancies of detail, sometimes they are rather big differences of emphasis. For example, in Mark's gospel, we have a very gripping and powerful portrayal of Jesus going to his crucifixion. He's been betrayed, he's been denied, he's been put before Pontius Pilate when all his followers have fled. Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus simply answers two words, "You say so." And after that, he's silent the rest of the time. They take him off to be crucified. He doesn't say a thing. They nail him to the cross. He's completely silent. He's hanging on the cross. People are mocking him, and he's silent. The passers-by mock him. The Roman soldiers mock him. Both criminals mock him, and he says nothing until the very end when he cries out, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, why, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And he dies. This is a portrayal of a man who is shocked at what's happening to him, and he doesn't say a word the whole time because he seems unsure of himself. If you read Mark, that's the portrayal. The thing is, the other Gospels have other portrayals. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, we have a very different portrayal from the one in Mark, because in Luke, Jesus is not silent the whole time. Jesus is being led off to be crucified. And instead of being silent, he sees these women by the road, and he says, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't wait for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children, for the fate that's to befall you." He's more worried about these women than he is about himself. While being nailed to the cross in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is not silent. He says, "Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing." When he's hanging on the cross in Luke's Gospel, Jesus actually has an intelligent conversation with one of the other people being crucified. One of them mocks Jesus. In Mark, they both mock him. In Luke, it's just one of them mocks Jesus. The other one turns his head to him and tells him to be quiet because Jesus has done nothing to deserve this fate. And then he turns to Jesus and he says, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And Jesus replies, truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Here in Luke, Jesus knows exactly what's happening to him. He knows why it's happening to him. And he knows what's going to happen to him after it happens to him. He's going to wake up in paradise, and this guy's going to be with him. This is not Jesus in shock and in doubt and wondering why God has forsaken him, so that it's especially striking that at the very end, instead of crying out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Jesus says, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, and he dies. Luke has a very different portrayal of Jesus at his death than Mark has. The problem is people take Luke's portrayal and they take Mark's portrayal and they smash them together into one mega portrayal. And then they throw in Matthew and then they throw in John. So Jesus says everything that he says in all four Gospels, and you have the 7 last words of the dying Jesus found in precisely none of the Gospels. Each of the Gospels has something different it wants to say about Jesus. And if you smash them all together, you've written your own Gospel, instead of letting each of these authors have his own say. But since they are different, they're fantastic stories, and you might find them theologically invaluable, but they can't all be right historically. We are debating whether the Gospels give us historically reliable accounts of Jesus. You will have noticed that even Craig wants to bracket the Gospel of John. As well he should, because John does not give us a historically reliable portrayal of Jesus. In John's Gospel, Jesus spends most of his public ministry telling his disciples that he is a divine being who is descended from heaven, come down from the Father, so that he can reveal the truth so that those who believe in him will have eternal life. You don't find that teaching anywhere in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. In John's Gospel, Jesus constantly says, I am. Before Abraham was, I am. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. I and the Father are one. These sayings about Jesus being divine are found in John and only in John. Did the others just not want to mention that part? Well, they're different because they're not all historically accurate. Let me conclude by giving you an analogy. Suppose there were 4 eyewitnesses to a murder. These 4 eyewitnesses all wrote down their accounts. When the 4 accounts were compared in court, they were filled with contradictions and discrepancies. Some of these were small details, some were big. They also included some details of things that everybody knows could not really have happened. Would you come away from these 4 eyewitness reports saying that the 4 give us completely trustworthy historical accounts of what happened? No, you wouldn't. If you were a prosecuting attorney, you would try to figure out how to get historical material out of these 4 accounts, to decide what really happened based on 4 problematic accounts. That's what we have with the historical Jesus. It's true that scholars think that we can say some things about the historical Jesus, maybe even a lot of things. But it's not because the Gospels give us historically accurate portrayals of Jesus. If they did that, we wouldn't need scholars to tell us what really happened. All we would have to do is read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Thank you very much.
Oh, come on, Bart. Tell us what you think. You know, I'm glad that Professor Ehrman closed his remarks by returning to something that he said at the beginning. And this is how he said it the first time. I think I got it right and wrote it down. If the Gospels were reliable, we would not need scholarship. That is profoundly mistaken. and it was repeated at the end. Now, let me hasten to say, I don't mean to take the Bible out of the hands of the layman who hasn't studied Greek or Hebrew or doesn't know anything about the Dead Sea Scrolls or archaeology or anything like that. I think that you can sit down and read one of the Gospels top to bottom and have a very good idea of what Jesus' teaching is. I believe all three synoptic Gospels, if we're talking strictly historical Jesus, we can say things, and probably will during question time, about John and its profound theology that ultimately grows out of Jesus and his significance. But I think anyone here in this room could sit down and read Matthew and get a very good idea of what Jesus' teaching is and what he was all about. You can sit down and read Mark, same thing. Luke, same thing. So I don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not trying to pull the Gospels out of your hands and say, I'm sorry, until you get a Ph.D. and you work in an archaeological dig, you're not qualified to understand it. That's not what I'm saying. But scholarship always tries to go way beyond what is right there on the surface and is pretty obvious, and that's good that they do. So to return to that question, if the Gospels were reliable, we wouldn't need scholarship. No. Scholarship does basically two things. Number one, it does distinguish what's considered historical from the interpretation that Matthew or Mark or Luke or John in his own special way bring into the discussion. And in fact, we want to know both of those things. See, my fault for the super conservative, the extreme on the right, is the theological contribution of Matthew, Mark, or Luke usually is ignored. And there's the preoccupation only with the historical. And that's a shame, because Matthew was a theologian and had some things to say. So was Mark, so was Luke. Very powerful theology, right up there with Paul in his epistles. So scholars concerned with the historical Jesus engage these texts and all of these disciplines that are related because they're after greater clarity in two areas. One, which part can we, in other words, get behind the text and imagine in an informed way the world of the historical Jesus and what he's doing without just reading into that some of our own ideas. And secondly, then explain what each means, the historical part and the interpretation part, in proper context, and that's where the big labor comes in. Oftentimes in a historical Jesus book, you'll just have an opening chapter that talks about the criteria for determining authenticity. They'll be outlined, and they'll usually say, because I realize that skeptics and others will be reading the book, I don't want to beg the question, any special pleading. I will talk about the texts that I feel very confident have a good, solid argument in favor of their authenticity. And that tends to be why not every single verse, not every single passage is appealed to. It's a selection, a smaller group, because it's on firmer ground. So the scholarship will maybe a chapter, but the bulk of the book will be devoted then to interpreting this material, the historical Jesus or the theology of the respective evangelists, whichever direction this book is taking, and then interpret it in the light of historical sources, the literature, various writings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, things like that, archaeology, the land of Israel, the topography, the geography, these kinds of things that, well, the average reader might not know, and the average reader will benefit from that and have a much clearer idea of the world of Jesus and a much greater sense. Oh, that's what he's talking about when he says this. This is why, if it's the other kind of book, looking at the theology of the evangelists, this is why he presents it this way. Now, let me put another question to you. What if we had only one gospel? We had Mark. That's it. The only gospel in the New Testament. You know what? We wouldn't have any discrepancies. What do you know? All the discrepancies just whoop, vanish. Are we better off? If we didn't have Matthew and Luke, are we better off? We have Matthew and Luke, and yep, we have discrepancies. They tell the stories differently. Indeed, they do. But our knowledge is greatly enriched. So I'm glad we have 3 synoptics instead of just 1. Time does not permit to work through the details of every other little item about did John change the date on which Jesus was crucified or the date of the Passover. Folks, that's a very complicated question. It isn't clear that the synoptics themselves have actually pinned a date. Bart is assuming, and he might have been right on that, but it's a complex question of that chronology. Which day was Passover? There's a lot of literature on that topic. And the census, really a census for the basis of taxation, is not that simple, and it has nothing to do with who your ancestors were 1,000 years ago. He's of the house of David. He's a Davidic descendant, and his home family base is in Bethlehem during the resettlement in the 1st and 2nd centuries BC. There were many Jews in Judea who were moved northward into Galilee. Josephus and the Josephus tells us about it. We have information about that. That's why Nazareth probably got its name, its branch town. It's a town from Isaiah 11 because there's a reference to the person that will replace David's line someday called Branch. And I could go on with other things like that, details at the cross and so on. The point is this is an oversimplification. I'm not saying Professor Ehrman is wrong to point them out. These are good questions, and scholarship is concerned with them. And yes, scholars do come to different conclusions, but it is not as cut and dried as you heard presented a few minutes ago. Thank you.
So many arguments and so little time. Well, thank you, Craig, for that lively response. I want to claim to be misrepresented. When Craig quoted me saying, if the Gospels were reliable, we wouldn't need scholarship, I meant we wouldn't need scholarship to establish what is historically probable. Of course we would need scholarship. We would need people still to tell us about the geography of Palestine or the topography of Palestine, or about what was going on in the days of Palestine. Of course we would need all that. So that's not really up to dispute. What I'm talking about is historical reliability. If Craig is trying to tell us that if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, simply read them without any comparison between them, you just read them and you come away with a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus, if that's really what he wants to say, then how can he also agree that since there are 3 of them, there are discrepancies? Discrepancies are not necessary between 3 accounts. You can get 3 biographies of Abraham Lincoln that basically agree on everything. They don't have to have discrepancies. But if they do have discrepancies, and these are large discrepancies, then all 3 biographies cannot be historically right. They might make for good reading, they might be very interesting, but they can't all be historically right. Craig, from the very beginning, acknowledged that, in fact, the Gospels are only part history and part what he calls interpretation. I agree 100%. There are nuggets of historically reliable information in the Gospels. There's also a lot of interpretation. When John changed the date of Jesus' death, it was because of his interpretation. He wanted to show that Jesus was the Lamb of God who took away the sins of the world. And so he died on the same day, at the same hour, at the hands of the same people who killed the sacrificial lambs at the Passover. John changed it because he had an interpretation that he wanted to impose upon it, and I've got no problem with that. I'm quite happy for people to change stories about Jesus. What I refuse to accept, though, is that if somebody changes the story for their interpretation, which they're free to do, and I'm happy for them to do that, I refuse to accept that if they do that, that they are still being historically accurate. They're not being historically accurate anymore. They've changed the historical facts. We as modern people are not generally all that interested in the methods of ancient historiography. I assume that's true. I assume that most of you have not read books about ancient historiography. This just isn't something that most of us are that concerned about. Craig and I are, because we're scholars, and this is what we do for a living. But when you talk about something happening in history, you're not talking about it according to the standards of somebody living 2,000 years ago. You're talking about what you mean by history. When you read an account and you say, is this an accurate account? You want to know, did it really happen like this? A very simple question. And it has a very simple answer when it comes to the Gospels. When you read the Gospels and you ask, did it really happen like this? The answer is no. It did not happen like this. If it happened like that, you wouldn't have to have historians devising the criteria that Craig has talked about. Craig says that in the bulk of books written about Jesus, the first chapter will talk about criteria and the rest will talk about something else. The something else they talk about is using these criteria. How do we know what really happened in the life of Jesus? This happens in book after book after book after book after book after book. How do we know what really happened in the life of Jesus? And the reason scholars have to ask the question is because all scholars know that you simply can't read Matthew and say, oh yes, well Jesus did this, he did this, he did this, he did this, and did that, and that's all historically accurate. Scholars don't do it that way. The only scholars who do it that way are fundamentalists who take the Gospels as historically accurate accounts. Nobody else takes them as historically accurate accounts, which is why you have so many hundreds of books written about the historical Jesus. The Christians who were writing these books were changing their stories in light of their interpretation. Again, I think that's perfectly fine. But it means that they changed historical information in order to convey their theological points. This is not true only of the Gospel of John, although in John it's the most clear case of it. But it's equally true with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. These are not historically accurate portrayals of Jesus. They are theologically driven accounts of Jesus' life by people who had things more important to do than to give history lessons about what was going on in Palestine in the 20s during the Roman Empire. They're not history books. They should not be read as history books, and they should not be assumed to be historical because, in fact, they quite clearly are not. Thank you.
We will now move into the dialogue portion of this evening, where both participants will join us on stage here, and they'll go back and forth asking each other questions for the next 15 minutes. So, gentlemen, if you'd like to come forward.
Okay, so we're just going to ask each other questions, and probably what we'll do mainly is pontificate. So, let me start. Craig, I guess I have a twofold question. The first question is, I know we haven't talked in here about what the criteria are that scholars use to decide what's historical and what's probably not historical in the Gospels. And I don't think it's important for us to go over these criteria because they're common among scholars, but they don't really matter for what I want to ask, which is this. Do you agree that scholars of the historical Jesus do, in fact, utilize these criteria in order to establish what's historically authentic in the materials in the Gospels? And if they do apply these criteria, then why do they do that if the Gospels already are historically accurate?
Okay, very good question. For one thing, a scholar could go into the Gospels and have great confidence and say, you know, this is historical material, but you know what? Not all of my readers will assume that. And Ed Sanders, in fact, in his book that I referred to, Jesus and Judas in 1985, has a very good statement about why criteria are important. And he says, look, if anybody asserts something, such as this is inauthentic, or this is authentic, or this over here is history, but this is something else, he says they're assuming a burden of proof. And have to give reasons for it. I agree with that. I agree with that. And so You can trace back 20 years, more than 20 years in my publications relating to the historical Jesus. And you'll see me all the time talking about criteria. And I'll then go on and say, now, I'm going to use in my discussion of some topic, whatever it is, Jesus' proclamation of the kingdom, or Jesus' idea about forgiveness, or Jesus' idea about this or that, and I'll make a selective use of text. And so I'll say, well, I'm using these texts because they enjoy support from these criteria. I try to have materials, I hope, enjoy the support of two or more of the criteria. But it doesn't mean, I think, that traditions, sayings, deeds, activities, things attributed to Jesus therefore go down the tubes because they don't meet with the criteria. The criteria are fairly rigid, fairly tough, but what I hope is that skeptical readers, honest, inquiring readers like Professor Ehrman, when they read what I've written, they'll say, hey, yeah, that's okay, yeah, okay, you've given pretty good reasons for why you have brought to the front for discussion these particular passages. Yeah, that's okay. And see, that's why these criteria are important. However, back to the interpretive thing, the criteria also help us, and also just the comparison. Often it's usually just seeing what Matthew has done with Mark, or Luke has done with Mark. You can then, it highlights the interpretive feature. And that's important too, because many scholars, they write book after book after book because they want to know things about the theology of Matthew. And if they say, oh, yes, this is Matthew's special edition here, this is Matthew doing that, but oops, no it isn't. It's just old tradition he's inherited. Well, that might not be Matthew's special interest at all. And so these are the reason why criteria come into play, and this is why these scholarly books tend to get lengthy and have big, long footnotes. And also there's a measure of subjectivity and guesswork, educated guesswork. And sometimes, you know, the field is so vast, we have to be forgiving toward one another. We can't be experts in everything. And so what will happen is we learn from one another. So some of my views expressed 20 years ago, I've changed them a bit because I know some of these other literatures and facts a little better.
Can I have a follow-up question?
Sure.
I mean, I think your view is not, I don't think that the view as you stated is the dominant view. But let me just ask specifically about Ed Sanders, whom we've both known for a very long time. Would you agree that Ed Sanders does not think that the Gospels give us historically reliable portraits of Jesus, and that in fact, in his book on Jesus, he eliminates a large number of stories found in the Gospels as being non-historical?
I think Ed, you know, if Ed were here, I'm not really sure how he would answer the question. I would not be surprised at all if he said, yes, the Gospels give us a historically reliable portrait of Jesus, but it's pruned. And I'm not sure that he always makes negative judgments. He does sometimes. It's the negative judgment that makes me a little bit nervous.
Well, okay, just take the first incident that you mentioned,
right.
the cleansing of the temple.
Okay.
The earliest account we have of this is in the Gospel of Mark. And do you remember what Ed says specifically about Mark's account?
I do.
I mean,
yeah, and I believe that's where I and a host of others, in fact, take him to task. Ed believes the temple incident occurred, and he interprets it in an interesting way. And I think he does make a mistake because he eliminates verse 17. This is Mark 11:17. By the way, you notice how scholars talk? It's almost like telepathy. And it's really funny. It reminds me of an old joke where convicts have been in prison for years and years, and they've told all the jokes over and over and over again. So they just give numbers to them. And so a guy says, 11, and they all roar with laughter. Someone else shouts out, 6, and they roar with laughter. And a newbie on the block says, 19. Oh, they all groan, and somebody says, you know, some guys just can't tell a joke. Scholars talk this way. You know, we'll say this, yeah, I know that, and then we'll even mention a piece of a verse where we don't have to do that, and we haven't bothered to tell anybody what chapter it is or whatever. But in 11:17, in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus paraphrases two little pieces or little snippets of two passages. He says, "Is it not written, my Father's house shall be called a house of prayer?" And that's right out of Isaiah 56. Profoundly significant passage, given the context. "But you have made it a cave of robbers." Three words, I think, in the Greek text, right out of Jeremiah 7:11. Ed, I think, makes a mistake and says, oh, this verse is probably added later in the tradition, maybe by Mark, as if trying to find a biblical explanation for Jesus' action, what he really was doing. And it wasn't a bad suggestion Ed made. Jesus is just demonstrating in a way to suggest the temple is going to be destroyed. Now, in broad outline, he accepts the temple demonstration as authentic, and he gets it more right than wrong as to what Jesus is doing. I think he just misses a key point, and I took issue with him in an essay that was published in 1989 in Catholic Biblical Quarterly, and some scholars, other scholars weighed in and agreed. But that's all part of our work. I mean, it could be, I got it wrong, and years later, I changed my mind. But I think in this case, I stick to my guns. I think Ed slipped on that. But most of his interpretation was good.
Yeah, what I'm referring to is where Ed specifically argues that Mark cannot be correct when it says that Jesus shut down the temple activity.
Oh, yeah. Well, I don't think that's all that... I don't think that's what Mark is saying at all. What is that verse? 16?
19.
That's at the end of the
Sorry,
story?
I can't tell a joke. Sorry.
Oh, yeah. Very good, yeah. We're just going to say numbers back and forth for the next 20 minutes. Yeah, I think did not permit anyone to pass through this area. And a lot of interpreters do not see that in this kind of a categorical, comprehensive sense. Because who would think that anyway? What first century writer would imagine that is what Mark is trying to say? The temple precincts are huge. Martin Hengel has an interesting comment.
Yeah, but that's why it couldn't happen.
Well, I don't think Mark is saying that that's what he did.
Yeah, my point is that that's what Ed thinks. And
that's right.
Yeah, that's the kind of thing historians do all the time. They figure out what cannot actually be historically accurate.
And sometimes when they discover, oops, that can't have been the case, I took the gospel the wrong way. I took the passage the wrong way. I need to see it in another way. And that is sometimes the result of that, and that is good.
Do you have a question for Bart?
Oh, sure. Let me... I don't have any doubt at all, none, anybody that reads the Gospel of John, however they understand it in terms of the historical question, no one can miss in reading John that the Christology, let's call it the divine Christology in John, is quite explicit. And Professor Ehrman has already referred to some of the statements and so on. I guess the question I would like to put to you, Bart, right now is, do you find any hints at divine Christology, and I think you know what I mean, in the Synoptic Gospels?
I think what you find in the Synoptic Gospels is that Jesus is clearly the Son of God.
Okay.
And the thing is, when we read the term Son of God today, we naturally think that has to do with divinity. So, a son of a dog is a dog, and the son of a cat is a cat, and the son of a God is God, and so that's how we think of it. Whereas for most ancient Jews, of course, that wasn't the way it was understood. The Son of God in the Hebrew Bible refers typically to people who are not God. I mean, it's used of the entire nation of Israel. Hosea chapter 11:1. Out of Egypt have I called my son, referring to the Exodus event. So the people of Israel is the Son of God, or the king of Israel, Solomon, is called the Son of God. 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 14. The Son of God. The Son of God for ancient Jews was a human being who manifested God's will on earth, did God's will on earth. He was somebody who was in a special relationship with God, but he was a human being. And I think that the Gospel of Mark, for example, understands Jesus as being the Son of God, but not as a somebody who came from God. I think in Mark's gospel, Jesus is very much a human being who was chosen by God to be the Messiah, and he fulfilled his task on earth by doing what God wanted him to do, which was to die on the cross. Yeah.
Most of that I don't have any problem accepting, except right near the end, when you say in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is just a human being and nothing more. I think that has a couple of problems. And one of them is the forgiveness of sins, where people are shocked. Who's this guy forgiving sins? Only God can do that. Mark chapter 2, but very interesting, in Mark chapter 3, when Jesus's miracles, particularly his exorcisms, are so remarkable that the contemporaries that can't deny them, but why not then assign them to an evil source? And so the rumor is it's Beelzebul who was empowering Jesus. And what I find intriguing is Jesus' response, where he says, you can't loot a strong man's house unless you first bind him, and then you can loot it. And most would agree that he's the strong man. Jesus is the stronger man who binds Satan, the strong man, and then in looting his house, the exorcisms, he releases the hostages, people that are under satanic bondage. I find that a remarkable claim. Does somebody who's just a man, or somebody that wears the mantle of a prophet or something, he's got the power to bind Satan? He has the authority to forgive sins. He has authority to make Sabbath pronouncements. Now, I know that might not seem much to the average Gentile, but in the Jewish world in that time, that is God respects the Sabbath, and he has authority over the Sabbath. So I find very intriguing hints in the synoptics. Yes, they're implicit. They're nothing like in John in terms of being explicit, that Jesus is more than just a man who happens to have maybe some empowerment from the Spirit. I might add to that also the Isaiah 61 stuff, that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He's anointed me to preach and to do these various things. That passage, Jesus alludes to it in his Beatitudes in a couple of places, in his reply to the imprisoned John the Baptist, and explicitly cites it as fulfilled in Luke 4, although some scholars say, oh no, you can't accept that because it appears to be an expansion of Mark 6. I do accept it because it is so coherent and consistent elsewhere with Jesus' teaching. Now here's what's interesting. Jesus applies Isaiah 61 to himself. One of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Cave 11, document 13, it's also called 11 through Melchizedek, also exegetes and talks about Isaiah 61. And it is fulfilled, we're told, when someone who is, let's call him Melchizedek, comes, who does what? Forgives sins, defeats Satan, and actually stands in the place of God. When Isaiah 61:2 was quoted in this document, it actually says that the year of Melchizedek's favor. If you look at the Hebrew text, it's the year of Yahweh's favor. So I find some pretty provocative, suggestive materials in the synoptics, just the synoptics, without appeal to John.
Yeah, and I obviously read those very differently from you. Ed Sanders, for example, on the forgiveness of sins. There are several ways of reading this. It's his opponents who say that only God can forgive sins. Jesus never affirms that. Sanders thinks that what's going on is that Jesus is usurping the role of the priests in the temple. That the priest in the temple, when a sacrifice is made, declares the sins of the person forgiven. And Jesus is saying that he himself has the power that these priests have in the temple, which would mean it's got nothing to do with him being God. I think if Jesus were God and Mark thought that Jesus was God, he certainly wouldn't put it in subtle terms. If I'm writing a biography of somebody who was the Lord God, I would make sure that I said something about it.
Well, I think it may attest to Mark's desire to restrain himself and tell it like it is, tell it like it happened,
but telling it like it is,
miss out on that chance to really gussy it up.
But he wouldn't have to gussy it up if Jesus was God and he went around saying that I and the Father are one, and before Abraham was, I am, and if he was declaring himself God, then it's impossible for me to imagine that somebody writing about him would say, well, that part's not important.
That's not quite the way I was putting it, and maybe I didn't make it clear. Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels doesn't walk around saying, hello, I'm Jesus Christ, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Son of God, and I'm the second person of the Trinity. There's nothing like that, and this theology is largely inferred and confessed and put together subsequently, not only subsequently in the New Testament, but also down through the centuries in the creeds of the church. So I'm not trying to, read the Nicene Creed into the Gospel of Mark. All I'm saying is that there are some extraordinary things in even the synoptics, even in the simplest of the three, Mark, that are very suggestive. For example, another Dead Sea Scroll from Cave 4, number 521. 4Q 521, the fragment I have in mind, it's fragment 2, I believe it is, and it's a piece of column 2 at that point. And it begins with, heaven and earth will obey his Messiah and all that is in them. And it's an interesting blending of Psalm 146 and passages from Isaiah, including Isaiah 61. And it goes on to say that, and unfortunately there's 2 or 3 holes in the middle of it, and so we get some broken sentences. But in either case, when this messianic figure comes, whom heaven and earth obeys, the blind will regain their sight, the sick will be healed, dead will be raised up, the poor will have good news preached to them. That happens when the Messiah comes on the scene. Now, scholars will debate, is it the Messiah himself whose vision is doing this, or is it God acting through him? In a way, that doesn't matter. If Jesus had healed somebody and you saw it, you were there, and you said, did you do that? He would say, he may well say, my Father in heaven did it. I mean, it's not necessarily important to distinguish that. It's this coherence between things that Jesus says and does, even in the synoptics, with remarkable things. Defeating Satan, binding Satan, declaring Sabbath law, forgiving sins, and I do agree there could well be a priestly encroachment in vision here, such as declaring a cleansed leper clean. It's the priest who declares him clean. And the stilling of the storm story in Mark where the disciples are just awestruck. Who is this who commands even the wind and the waves? That's what Messiah is supposed to do.
Okay, Craig, we're going to run out of time.
I think you guys could have another debate on this, actually.
Yeah, we could. Could I ask another question?
Sure. Last question.
Okay.
Good.
Do you think that there's any non-historical material in Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And if so, could you name 2 or 3 incidents that you think are non-historical?
What my approach to that is, first of all, the number one thing is what is historical in this sense that it's historical. You have asides, you have comments, you have material that isn't history properly speaking, explanations, glosses, things like that. So I'm not talking about that. So what I do, I don't like negative judgments. I think they're presumptuous, and they could be embarrassing when other information comes to light. So I'll repeat what I said earlier. I'll say, okay, this looks rock solid. I give very good reasons for it. I'm not sure about this, and so that's under a question mark. So I'm not sure about that, and it might be for some of the reasons that Professor Ehrman's mentioned. It's hard to fit it into the historical context. It's discrepant. Which way is it? And so that's how I operate, but I'm very reluctant to circle something and say, oh yeah, that couldn't have happened. That's factually unhistorical. So I just, in fact, don't do that. It is bracketed, and it's held in abeyance, and it may stay there the rest of my life, and some of it might actually come out when other things are learned. Okay. That's a good question, and everyone needs to think about that if you get into this kind of scholarship.
Do we have the Q&A ready to go? Okay, so first question is for gentlemen are going to have neck problems tomorrow morning. Dr. Ehrman, both you and Dr. Evans agree on the problems in the text, i.e. the gospel writers theologize of the life of Jesus. Yet you both come to different conclusions. How much of the debate is really about the suppositions that you each bring to the same sets of data?
Yeah, I think it's a good question and raises a good point. I think it's a little bit harder for me to answer with respect to Craig, because I'm not in his mind and I don't know exactly what his suppositions are, but I can answer it for myself, that when I held views very similar to those that Craig has so elegantly laid out, I did have a set of suppositions that affected how I viewed things, and now I have a different set of suppositions from how I view things, and it certainly does affect how one deals with the matter. When I was a conservative evangelical Christian, even if I saw something that looked like a discrepancy, I gave it the benefit of the doubt because I thought that the Bible was the inspired Word of God and there couldn't be any serious mistakes in it or historical inaccuracies in it. I got to a point where I ended up saying that maybe I could look at it differently. That instead of assuming or supposing that there could be no serious mistakes in the Bible, so that when I saw something, it wasn't a mistake, that was my earlier supposition, what if I simply left the question open and asked, are there historical discrepancies in the Gospels? If you approach it that way, then you're not presupposing your conclusion. I'm not saying that Craig presupposes a conclusion, I'm talking about myself. That once I acknowledged that, in fact, I was just going to see, are there mistakes or not? And once you do that, you start finding them all over the place. Discrepancies, contradictions, factual statements that simply could not be right historically. Once you allow that they're possible, you find them. And so I tell this to my students, that they, of course, can assume that the Bible is the inspired Word of God with no mistakes in it, and if that's your view, you won't find mistakes. On the other hand, if you simply leave it open, are there mistakes, then you can decide whether there are mistakes. There won't necessarily be mistakes if you allow for the possibility, you just look to see if there are mistakes. And so I think the supposition ends up affecting the conclusion. You can have the same data, but different conclusions, and I expect largely that's what's going on with Craig and me, is that we do look at the same data, but do come to different conclusions.
Okay, next question is for Dr. Evans. Other ancient people have miracles attributed to them, yet scholars do not seem to be arguing strongly for the authenticity of these miracles. Why should we argue for, much less believe in miracles that are associated with Jesus if we are not willing to believe in other claims of miracles?
Very good question. I'm really glad somebody asked that. I don't slam the door on anything of a supernatural nature that is outside of biblical literature. I have colleagues, I've had colleagues over the years who do that. I frankly find it inconsistent. I had a good colleague at Trinity for many, many years who teaches philosophy, and in fact, he influenced me a lot in that department. And so let me explain. Let me put that comment in context, and it actually gives me a chance to mention what my presuppositions are. I am a theist. I do believe in God. I am a Christian, and I agree with the Apostle Paul, who had a remarkable encounter with Christ and talked about it, and said in one of his Corinthian letters, God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And that, no doubt, does influence my presuppositions. But what about history? Historically, what's my presupposition? I am conservative. Now, don't misunderstand what I just said. I'm not saying that puts me to the right. Not at all. There are historians who, I don't know if they're Christians or not, but they're conservative. It's a philosophy toward the evidence. You don't have to be that way. And some people tend to be more skeptical or whatever, and I don't judge them. It's a case-by-case thing. And so I regard ancient evidences and ancient literature, frankly, as very precious. And I'm so glad we have so little of it. And we have such large gaps. And I get exasperated with some who are eager to say, oh, well, this can't be trusted, that can't be trusted. We could be talking about Greek history, Roman history, something else. I don't believe in being gullible, and that's why I believe in the criteria we spoke about earlier, about authenticity criteria and so on. So in other words, there has to be some good reasons to say, I think that Thucydides at this point really is telling the truth, or he's got his facts straight, or Herodotus, or Suetonius, or some of these other historians from the past. It's almost like a love for them. I'm so glad, guys, you did your thing. When I was in university, I was a history major. And one of my fascinating subjects was evaluating documents. I have my old textbook from that course. But I am a supernaturalist that grows out of being a theist. And so my knee-jerk reaction is not, there is no knee-jerk reaction to say that if there is a miracle reported, that simply because it's outside the Christian tradition, it's to be just written off and ignored. I don't think that's intellectually fair. I don't think that is being open-minded. I don't think that is being consistent. I'm not going to be gullible about it. It may not have very good support behind it in terms of evidence and eyewitness and so on. Well, okay. But my knee-jerk reaction is not to say, I can't even consider it. Thanks for that question.
Okay, another question for Dr. Ehrman. A large portion of the four Gospels contains Jesus' teaching. Given your skepticism of the Gospels, when you read the Gospels, is there anything in Jesus' teaching that you think originated with the historical Jesus? If so, what do you think actually came from Jesus in the Gospels?
Yeah, great question. Thank you very much. I don't want to be misheard as saying that I don't think we can know anything about the historical Jesus. I don't think that at all. So when Craig set out his two alternatives early on about the left and the right, the people who hold to inerrancy on the one hand, and the people you think you can't know anything on the other, I'm not in either camp. I think absolutely we can know things about the historical Jesus. The first book that I wrote for a popular audience was a book that tried to explain what we can know about the historical Jesus. My view is that Jesus was principally a Jewish apocalyptic prophet whose proclamation was what is recorded in some passages in the Synoptic Gospels, that the end of the age was imminent, that God was soon going to intervene in history and overthrow the forces of evil and set up a good kingdom on earth, a kingdom in which there would be no more pain, misery, or suffering, where the good would be rewarded and those who were evil would be punished, that this was going to bring in a new kingdom on earth where history as we know it would come to a climactic end and God would start a new period, a new kingdom on earth. That this was going to come when God sent the Son of Man from heaven, that the Son of Man would judge all those who were opposed to God and bring the kingdom to those who were on God's side, and that Jesus thought it was going to happen within his own generation. Some of you standing here will not taste death before they see that the kingdom of God has come in power. So Jesus expected the climactic end of history as we know it within his lifetime, or within his disciples' lifetime. So I think we can definitely say things about the historical Jesus, that the information about that comes from the Synoptic Gospels principally, but it's not because the Gospels themselves give you a historically accurate portrayal of Jesus. They are full of interpretation. You have to use the criteria that we've referred to on a number of occasions to get behind the Gospels portrayal in order to see what actually happened in the life of Jesus.
Okay, Dr. Evans, Paul is the earliest writer of the New Testament, but doesn't seem to speak much about Jesus. Why is this?
Oh, very good question. That's a subfield in itself. Jimmy Dunn and a number of other scholars have talked about the Jesus tradition in Paul. That's how they usually speak about it. And the tallies are not always the same, as we would expect, because sometimes it's difficult to tell what's being alluded to. And what, it's pretty obvious if there's a quotation, but what is harder to detect are allusions. And Jimmy wrote an essay on this very subject for a book that I published. It's been a number of years, and I was impressed. He took a very conservative approach. He didn't want to cast his net too widely, but he came up with a number of very interesting sayings, very likely Paul paraphrasing, sometimes almost quoting things that Jesus had said. But it's a good question, and we could ask, well, why isn't there more? And remember, Paul was not one of the 12. And so Paul he's eager. You see this in his letter that he wrote to the churches in the district of Galatia, or what we call Galatians. And he doesn't, he wants to maintain his independence to some degree, his claim to apostleship, his vision of Christ, his experience of the risen Christ, and his call to be an apostle. He wants to make that really clear. It came directly from Christ. He didn't get trained at the apostleship school and was given a degree handed to him by Peter so that he might now become an apostle. He really emphasizes his independence. And I wonder if that's not part of it too. So of course he's met these apostles. Of course he's learned stuff. He admits he's received tradition. I pass on to you what I received. Sure he did. But that might be part of it. But then again, what has he given us? Paul didn't sit down and write out a gospel. He wrote several epistles. And in them, he's mostly exhorting, he's explaining things, he's talking about justification, he's talking about sins to avoid, he's promoting harmony and good fellowship among the believers. And so he cites along the way some sayings. But for Paul, the overall powerful thing, Jesus died for us, he gave himself up for us. So for crying out loud, quit being arrogant, be more tolerant and loving and forgiving toward one another. And also, by the way, no matter how bad things might be, remember Christ has been raised up and we have hope therefore. So I'm not too surprised in a way that Paul doesn't say, oh, let me tell you about the stilling on the storm. Oh, by the way, let me tell you about the feeding of the 5,000. Let me run by you a couple of other healing stories. I'm not too surprised that Paul makes the use of the Jesus tradition the way he does. Good question.
Okay. Dr. Ehrman, in your books you acknowledge that there are quite a few things about Jesus that we can know with relative confidence. You also say that the Gospels are not historically reliable. How do these things work together at the same time?
Yeah, great question. It's the key question. Craig and I have repeatedly mentioned the criteria. And I'm a little sorry now that we haven't gotten into them because it's a little bit hard to answer this question without talking about how scholars actually use historically unreliable sources in order to derive historical information. But that's what scholars do. It's not just in the realm of the New Testament. Scholars have this problem in every field. Scholars of ancient Greece and Rome face this problem. Scholars of the Middle Ages face this problem. Even scholars of modern history face this problem, that they'll have accounts that they know have inaccuracies in them, discrepancies, contradictions, things that obviously did not really happen, and so they're not historically reliable in and of themselves, but they might contain historical information. And the question is, how do you mine these inaccurate accounts for the historically accurate information? And that's where scholars have devised criteria for dealing with these kinds of sources to help you figure out what probably happened and what probably did not happen. And so on the surface it may seem like a contradiction that for me to say, well, the accounts are inaccurate, and yet here's an accurate portrayal, but it's not a contradiction. You use these problematic sources in very careful ways with rigorous methodology, following strict criteria, and you can find what's historically accurate within them, so that the Gospels contain historically accurate information, even though the overall portrayal of these Gospels is inaccurate.
Dr. Evans. In Dr. Ehrman's books, he uses the phone game analogy as a model for how the Jesus tradition was passed on between the time of Jesus and the writing of the New Testament Gospels. What do you think of this analogy?
Well, I think it needs to be qualified, if not outright rejected. The phone game, if you don't know, person A tells person B a story. Not several times. It doesn't ask person B to memorize it. He just tells it once. Person B then turns around and tries to remember that story and repeat it to person C. Again, doesn't repeat it and wait until person C has got it right. And then C tells D. And of course, what makes the game fun, how many here have played the game? It's a parlor game. Do you really want to get the details right? No. I've never had my students in my lectures play this game. They make sure they get it right because an exam is coming. Okay, so the dynamics in my classroom are not a parlor game. And when Jesus is teaching his disciples, they're not clowning around and repeating his teaching loosely and carelessly and didn't quite get it right and turn it inside out and everything else. And so what we have then, and some of this is inferential because the book of Acts is our only account that's early. There are other books of Acts from much later times. But the book of Acts, unfortunately, doesn't give us too much information. You get the councils, you get people getting together and making decisions. So the pedagogy of the early church itself is a bit unclear. But what and I'm not going to go down get into an involved discussion of eyewitness tradition, but I think there is an eyewitness tradition and that it's significant. And in my own opinion, Professor Ehrman, I think, not because he said anything tonight, but on previous occasions, I think he goes a little too lightly on that. I'm very impressed by the work of the Swedish scholar Samuel Burskog. I'm very impressed with Richard Bauckham and his work, and others who talk about an eyewitness tradition and the markers and indicators of that. However, what I find really interesting is Q, to go back to that, the 250, 60, 70 verses or so that Matthew and Luke have in common. They didn't get this out of Mark. They have this material in common that gives them the opportunity to give us longer discourses of Jesus' teaching and so on. And some see Q as very, very early. Why? It doesn't seem to reflect Easter. It doesn't seem to reflect Passion Week. In other words, the Q tradition is the didache, the teaching of Jesus. And so how then is this teaching remembered? Is it just person A tells B, who then turns around without even trying to learn it and tells C? No, not at all. It's a community preservation of a body of teaching. There's a collectivity, there's a community factor that holds it intact. And that's why you don't see wild, crazy stuff. You do later in the 2nd century and the 3rd century. You see some oddball stuff teaching. The Gnostic Gospels, of course, give us a Jesus who is wholly different. But I think it's because you have this, I don't know what words even to use, but you have this body of material that the disciples themselves know and others who become acquainted with it and learn it and teach it, and this has a controlling and stabilizing effect. Good question.
Okay, now we're going to move into closing statements. And Dr. Evans, you have the first 5 minutes.
Folks, for some of you who you wonder, oh, they disagree. You know what? That's okay. And that's what we do as scholars. We often disagree. I've seen some heated exchanges. I mean, I think Bart probably has too, and we could tell some stories that would be amazing about things that have happened at SBL meetings and perhaps at other meetings. I've seen people throw their paper up into the air and the pages come down. I've seen people storm out of the room and so on. But this is a collegial exchange, even though obviously we differ quite significantly at certain points. My final thoughts. I believe it is justified to say that the Gospels contain reliable historical material that is sufficient for the task, and that is talking about or presenting a portrait of the historical Jesus. In fact, I believe each synoptic gospel on its own is sufficient for discovering and presenting and constructing a plausible portrait of the historical Jesus. But of course, the three together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, provide us with a rich trove of material. So I allude once again to Ed Sanders. We can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish, that we can know a lot about what he said, and that those two things make sense within the world of first century Judaism. He is able to say that because the Gospels do contain a substantial amount of historical material. Yes, there's a lot of work to do in interpreting and contextualizing and making sure that our theories rest on well-established sayings of Jesus or deeds of Jesus, and not on ones that skeptics might think just don't stand up. I ask all of us to consider this question. What best explains the origins of the Christian faith and its widespread, lasting positive impact on the world, especially on the West? An early movement that couldn't remember or understand what Jesus taught, and three Gospels that got it all garbled? Or an early movement that did remember and did understand what Jesus taught, and has three Gospels that, in fact, got it right? In my opinion, the latter option makes far more sense. Thank you.
Well, yes, thank you again, all of you, for coming out, and thank you, Craig, for another lively debate. It's been very interesting and informative. I have been insisting that the Gospels are very different from one another, and I want to explain in my closing comments why that is. It relates to some of the things Craig was saying. We are accustomed to thinking of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as being the authors of our four Gospels. Our four Gospels actually don't claim to be written by people named Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The four Gospels are all anonymous. The titles with the names were added much later, decades later. We don't know who wrote these books. What we know is that whoever wrote these books, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were writing in Greek, and that they were very well-educated Greek-speaking Christians. The reason that matters is because Jesus' disciples were not well-educated Greek-speaking Christians. They were lower-class, Aramaic-speaking peasants from rural Galilee. These Gospels were not written by the people who were there to see these things take place. How did they get their information? Well, most scholars date the Gospels to 20, 30, 40 or 50 years after Jesus' death. 40 or 50, 60 years after Jesus' death is when we get the first accounts of his life. How did these authors get their stories? After Jesus died, his disciples started convincing people that he had been raised from the dead. The Christian mission spread widely throughout the Roman Empire. It started off in Jerusalem, it moved up into Judea, it went into Syria, it went into Cilicia, it went over into what we now think of as Turkey, what was Asia Minor, into now what we think of as Greece, which was Achaia, Macedonia. It went all the way over to Rome. The way it's spreading is not by a disciple converting everybody. A disciple would convert somebody who would convert somebody who would convert somebody who would convert somebody. But the way you convert somebody is by telling them stories about Jesus. That's the only way to convert them. But the vast majority of these people telling these stories were not disciples. They couldn't be. The church is spreading throughout the entire Roman Empire in major urban areas. Stories about Jesus are being told every day, not by disciples, not by people trained to memorize teachings. They're being told by people who are excited by the fact that they've come to believe in the Son of God who's been raised from the dead. Stories do change when they get transmitted orally. They do, not just when you play the telephone game. And they change when people write them down. And the gospel writers themselves changed the stories. When Matthew took over Mark's gospel, he changed many of his stories. Most of his stories. In fact, probably just about all of his stories. And so did Luke. People are changing the stories. There's nothing wrong with changing stories as long as they're stories. But if you're interested in what happened historically, once you change the story, you might have a better story, but you no longer have a historically accurate portrayal. It is not radical to claim that there are discrepancies among the Gospels and that these discrepancies call their historicity into question. This is a commonplace view among scholars. It's found among scholars who teach at every major research university in North America. These scholars agree that the Gospels contain historical information, as Craig put it. Yes, we all agree they contain historical information, but these scholars also maintain that the Gospels as we have them are not accurate historical portrayals of Jesus. Let me end with an analogy to explain how it works. Suppose an artist came along and decided to do a portrait of Craig Evans. This portrait that he produced, in many ways, is very much like Craig. Extremely good looking, gray hair, clean shaven, glasses. But when you look at the portrait and look at Craig, they don't look anything alike. This portrait has accurate historical information in it about his gray hair, his clean shavenness, his glasses, and his good looks. But you would not say that the portrait, even though it contains accurate information, is an accurate portrait. And that's what you get with the Gospels. Thank you very much.